There exists a particular sensation that travels throughout the body when something foundational is on the verge of collapse, not to be destroyed, but rather to release what has been held back for far too long. Perhaps during recent hours, you've experienced sudden apprehension, tightness in your chest, lacking any rational explanation, or abrupt awakening in the middle of the night without apparent cause. It's crucial to recognize that what is being perceived at this moment isn't an illusion, nor is it a product of a mind unable to let go. What's unfolding right now is resonance. The threshold has already been reached. Energy recognizes this. The universe acknowledges it. And that's precisely why this message arrives today, at the exact instant when doubts have grown heavier than they should. In this content, it will become crystal clear what is about to change fundamentally, why persistent silence has never been synonymous with rejection, and what energetic resolution is now moving on levels imperceptible to the eye. Because even if it hasn't been spoken aloud, deep within you exists profound weariness, an exhaustion that doesn't stem from lack of rest, but from waiting, from manifestation, from attachment without definitive answers, from the sensation that time froze precisely when a sign was most needed. And yet, being in this place is no accident. Continuing to seek explanations to comprehend why this story doesn't conclude, even if it serves a higher purpose, requires speaking with the most raw and direct truth. This individual can no longer bear it. The structure of indifference and distance, constructed to maintain control, has begun crumbling under its own weight. There are connections that don't simply dissolve because one side decides to flee, because they weren't born solely from human desire, but from evolutionary purposes that transcend the will of the ego. When life unites two consciousnesses meant to evolve together, the path may become challenging, filled with obstacles and silence, but it never becomes meaningless. Even silence has its own language, a purity that triggers profound transformations, not visible right now, but soon to be understood. The relevance of this message lies in the fact that the situation has reached a point of no return. This person has also reached their limit. Emotional depletion isn't one-sided. It's mutual, even if in the eyes of the world it appears radically different. While on this side, uncertainty is processed through introspection or seeking spiritual answers, the other side struggles in deafening quietness. While here, doubts arise about whether it was worth it. Over there, involuntary memories begin emerging, memories that can no longer be suppressed. And although outward appearance suggests someone left and abandoned everything behind, on an energetic level, both sides are being worked on with equal intensity. And simultaneously, life doesn't allow a genuine connection to dissolve without bringing it to the point where the heart can no longer sustain old ways of operating. Sometimes, reaching the limit doesn't signify the end of the story, but rather the precise location where something new, more authentic, and less frightening takes shape. Perhaps the recurring question has been, why everything suddenly became so difficult? Why what once flowed naturally now causes pain? Or why this person distanced themselves just when everything seemed perfectly aligned? The answer that the ego fears, but the soul must hear, is that there was no true rejection, but rather an inevitable phase of preparation. Genuine love isn't built solely on the emotions of the beginning, but on the maturity granted by dedication and truth. There were dynamics that couldn't continue as they were. There were behaviors that needed to be broken, deep fears that needed to be revealed, and emotional dependencies that couldn't enter the new phase that destiny had prepared. The universe doesn't give what it isn't ready to hold. And when the heart feels it cannot continue, when the mind tires from understanding strategies, and the soul asks only for peace, that's precisely where energy acts with the greatest clarity. Not because surrender was noticed, but because the person has gone as far as humanly possible. This story didn't stop due to lack of love. It's being redefined. And this redefinition includes a resolution that this person is now making not from impulse, but from destiny's intervention, which no longer allows them to continue deceiving themselves. But to comprehend why this collapse is happening today, we must look at what occurred beneath the mask of indifference, in that personal space to which no one else has access. If you're ready to integrate this teaching into your life, share your thoughts in the comments. It's fascinating and simultaneously painful to observe how a person attempts to deceive themselves when confronted with overwhelming emotions. Right now, if we could observe this person's reality without filters, we would see a scene completely different from what they usually project, one based on fear and imagination. There exists a mistaken assumption that silence is equivalent to forgetting, or that physical distance is synonymous with inner peace. Nothing could be further from the truth. The person occupying your thoughts is restless, although they try to project an image of distance, coldness, or even complete indifference. Within them rages an internal conflict they can no longer ignore. For a long time, this individual has tried to maintain a prefabricated normality. They rise, fulfill their obligations, interact with their environment, and smile when appropriate. But there's a crack in this facade. The fatigue that was first felt on this side is now reflected there, not as guilt, but as brutal awareness. They're beginning to understand what was lost, what was avoided out of cowardice, and what couldn't be held at the right moment. Life allows emptiness to speak when words aren't enough. And this void has become unbearable, uncomfortable for those who run. They've tried to fill this space with all manner of distractions, perhaps excessive work, perhaps new superficial friendships, or simply constant technological noise to avoid hearing their own thoughts. But none of this works anymore. The void is no longer filled by distractions, nor by other people, nor by logical justifications. Because when a connection originates from the soul, nothing superficial can replace it. One can attempt to deceive the mind for a while, to rationalize the escape, to claim it was for the best, or that it wasn't the right time. But you cannot deceive the heart indefinitely. Here enters a destructive psychological phenomenon for those trying to forget through the failure of substitutes. Each time this person attempts to connect with someone else, or find refuge in activities that once brought joy, they encounter an invisible wall. Everything tastes bland. Conversations with others seem hollow, laughter sounds forced, and intimacy feels mechanical. This happens because they experienced a different depth with you. And once the soul has experienced such recognition, it doesn't settle for less. At some point, you may have wondered whether your intensity was excessive. Did you feel too strongly, or love more than necessary? But the absolute truth is that you didn't love too intensely. You loved from the right place. The problem wasn't in the intensity of what you offered. It was the timing discrepancy between two different internal processes. One was ready to go deeper, while the other was still learning to face what they feel. This learning that the other side is going through is typically painful because it means confronting parts of themselves they've avoided their entire life. Fear of vulnerability, fear of losing control, fear of depending on someone, fear that loving deeply might lead to inevitable suffering. These aren't superficial fears. They're rooted in past wounds, in defense mechanisms constructed over years, in traumatic experiences where opening the heart resulted in betrayal or abandonment. And facing these shadows requires more than courage. It requires internal preparation that can't be rushed. While you were ready to embrace the intensity of what you felt, they were barely beginning to recognize that what they experienced with you was different from anything they'd known before. And that recognition was terrifying. It wasn't rejection of you as a person. It was resistance to the magnitude of transformation that loving you would demand from them. They knew, even if unconsciously, that accepting this connection would mean dismantling their entire structure of protection, venturing into uncharted emotional territory, and trusting in something they couldn't control. The ego, whose primary function is survival and maintaining known patterns, perceived this as an existential threat. So it activated all available defense mechanisms: distance, coldness, silence, apparent indifference. But what the ego didn't account for is that the heart doesn't stop feeling simply because the mind decides to run. The soul doesn't forget a genuine connection just because fear demands retreat. And here lies the critical point of this entire process. While externally, this person may have appeared to move on, to forget, to be unaffected, internally, a completely different reality was unfolding. A silent but fierce battle between two opposite forces. The ego desperately trying to maintain control, and the heart relentlessly calling them back to what's real. This internal war has been consuming them in ways you probably couldn't imagine. In private moments, when all masks fall, and there's no one to impress, this person has been confronting their own truth. They remember everything. The way you looked at them, the conversations that touched something deep within, the moments of authentic connection that no rationalization can erase. They remember the feeling of being truly seen, understood in ways they'd never experienced before. And that memory haunts them because it revealed something they can no longer deny, that what they shared with you wasn't ordinary. It wasn't something they can find with anyone else. It wasn't something they can simply replace or forget. Recently, as time has passed and distance has supposedly created the space they needed, something unexpected began happening. Instead of finding peace or relief, they started experiencing an increasing emptiness, a sense that something essential is missing, a growing awareness that in running from you, they might have run from the best thing that ever happened to them. The internal dialogue has shifted dramatically. Where there was once certainty about needing to protect themselves, now there's doubt. Where there was conviction that distance was necessary, now there's questioning. Where there was confidence in their decision, now there's regret. This isn't happening because they're weak. This is happening because truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it's buried. The heart's voice, which they tried to silence through logic and fear, has been growing louder. And it's saying something they can no longer ignore, that you weren't the danger. The real danger was living a life devoid of the depth, authenticity, and love that you offered. They're realizing that all the reasons they used to justify distancing themselves were merely excuses disguising their fear. That all the logical arguments about timing, circumstances, or compatibility were just the ego's desperate attempt to avoid facing what was real. And this realization is devastating for them because it means acknowledging that they hurt not just you, but themselves. That in trying to protect themselves from potential pain, they created actual pain. That in attempting to avoid vulnerability, they lost something precious, something irreplaceable. Now they find themselves in a space of profound internal conflict. Part of them still wants to cling to the familiar patterns of self-protection, but another part, the part connected to their soul's truth, is demanding honesty, demanding courage, demanding that they stop running from what their heart knows to be real. And this internal pressure is building to a breaking point. The masks are crumbling, the defenses are weakening, the rationalizations no longer convince even them. They can't maintain the pretense of indifference anymore. They can't continue acting as if you didn't matter. They can't keep living as if the connection you shared was insignificant, because it wasn't, and they know it. This person is beginning to see that you weren't the enemy, not a threat, not the source of their fear. You were an invitation to grow, and the fear they felt wasn't because of you, but because of the immensity of what you could create together. The perspective is changing radically. What once seemed like an unacceptable risk now appears to be the only possible salvation from a gray and meaningless life. The initial rejection was an act of survival by an immature ego, but the ego cannot survive eternally against the heart's commands. The internal battle between the fear of suffering and the desire to love reaches its final resolution. This person finds themselves at a decisive crossroads, to continue protecting themselves and wither in solitude, or to risk feeling and existing, even if it means losing control. And the scales are slowly but irresistibly tipping toward surrender. Not surrendering to you as if you were an opponent, but surrendering to love as a transformative force. And right here, in the midst of this quiet yet fierce internal battle between an ego wanting safety and a soul demanding expansion, a fundamental shift occurred in the energy connecting you both. A turn that explains why suddenly everything feels different. Everything in this universe functions according to immutable laws of balance and compensation. What happens in the deep mind and shadow of this person doesn't remain isolated in their head. It sends out a purity and specific vibration that spreads and directly affects the shared reality between you both. Here enters the most decisive and tangible phenomenon of this current phase, a radical shift in energetic polarity. To understand this, one must honestly look at recent history. For a long time, the invisible dynamic between you followed the classic pattern of pursuit and resistance, perhaps without conscious intention, driven by fear and legitimate fear of loss. You sent enormous amounts of energy in that direction. There were messages, there was searching for answers, or there simply existed an obsessive and constant thought directed at their being. On a subtle level, this is perceived as physical pressure, like an unceasing wave pushing against a closed door. According to a fundamental physical law, when force presses, the natural reaction of the body receiving this impact is to tense, resist, and retreat to preserve its own balance. While you energetically moved forward, the other side instinctively withdrew. While you asked for clarity, the other side built walls of confusion. This was an exhausting and painful dance in which the roles seemed fixed and doomed to repeat eternally. However, recently something fundamental changed. You changed. Perhaps it was the result of extreme fatigue, an awakening of your own dignity, or higher spiritual understanding. But the fact is that you stopped pressing. You began withdrawing your energy from the equation. There's no longer that desperate vigilance about their movements. No more signals sent seeking external validation. And your thoughts, although they still return to the memory of the connection, no longer carry that agonizing plea that existed before. You started focusing on your own axis, living your life and prioritizing your own healing. This act, which at first glance might seem like sad resignation or a defensive mechanism, actually triggered an absolute earthquake in the other person's energetic system. By removing the pressure, you created what's known as a magnetic vacuum. Nature and energy detest a vacuum. They always seek to fill it. When you stopped occupying all the energetic space with your presence and persistence around this person, an abyss of silence opened. At first, this silence might have seemed like relief to their ego, a false sense of victory or freedom. But this phase lasts very briefly. Quickly, the absence of your energy begins to feel not like freedom, but like coldness. This person became, without knowing it, accustomed to feeding on your constant attention. Your energy was the fuel that sustained their sense of importance and security. By cutting off this supply, the other side was exposed to emotional weather. A fascinating phenomenon is now occurring. Because they no longer feel you behind them, this person feels an overwhelming impulse to look back. The law of the energetic rubber band has been activated. The closer you move to your own center, the more strongly the other side is pulled toward you. Now, in this precise minute of silence, they're genuinely beginning to miss you. Before, they couldn't miss you because your energetic presence was ubiquitous. There was no space for nostalgia. But now that real distance exists, memory has space to land and take root. And this isn't intellectual remembrance. It's a physical feeling of loss. This person is starting to feel that something vitally important is missing, a disappeared essential part of their internal structure. This shift in polarity leads to unexpected consequences for the one who fled. The weight of memory. Previously, when you maintained the connection through your efforts, you also carried the emotional burden of the relationship. You were the one processing emotions, suffering from doubts, the one keeping the flame alive. By letting go, you shed this weight. And this weight doesn't disappear, it simply transfers. Now it's the other person who must carry the entire emotional connection. Suddenly, memories they could previously ignore become obsessive and heavy. Emotions they suppressed crash down on them all at once, without you to soften the impact. That's why the indifference this person once displayed is beginning to crumble. They can no longer maintain the attitude of someone who doesn't care about anything, because now they feel everything with amplified force. They feel your absence as a phantom presence that follows them everywhere, at work, on the street, in the solitude of their room. Your energy paradoxically surrounds them now that you're no longer insisting. It's the universe's irony. By letting go, you connected. By stopping the pursuit, you began attracting. The energy you once tried using to break down their walls is now being used to create your own stability. And this makes you irresistibly attractive. This person feels that your availability is no longer guaranteed, not under their control, that your life continues, that your light shines without their permission, and this frightens them. The fear of losing you forever has replaced the fear of commitment. This energetic shift is real and tangible. This person now stands at a point where withdrawal brings relief. Internal tension grows with each day when nothing is said, with each moment when the impulse to act is suppressed. What once seemed like self-protection now feels like self-betrayal. The internal voice, long ignored, is no longer quiet. It demands honesty, consistency, and movement. Indecision now costs more energy than the courage to show themselves. And it's because of this that internal pressure becomes irresistible. Not from weakness, but because truth can no longer remain locked inside without causing harm. What follows now isn't an impulsive move, but a necessary action, one that emerges from clarity, not from fear. This story is moving toward a moment when silence no longer makes sense, and distance has lost its function. Whether the words will be perfect no longer matters. What matters is only that they're spoken, because what's real demands expression, and what's connected ultimately returns to each other. Here waiting ends not because someone pushed, but because internal truth demands its place.